Welcome to the Silent Empires, where every story is whispered through shadows, and power is felt more than it's seen. This channel was built for the night thinkers, the quiet listeners, the people who understand that silence can speak louder than words ever could. No interruptions, no distractions, just stories flowing endlessly into the dark. If this story held your attention for a while, show your support by leaving a like. And before you go, leave a comment telling me, what city are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Somewhere across the world, others are awake with us too, listening to the same silence at the exact same moment. On a damp November night in 1959, a small Brooklyn bar filled with the sounds of ordinary life. Glasses clinked, a jukebox murmured in the corner, and men in worn overcoats leaned on the counter, trading complaints about work and politics. Outside, the harbor air carried the smell of fuel and salt from the nearby piers. It could have been any bar on any night in any American city. But this particular room on this particular evening was the endpoint of a long chain of quiet decisions, unspoken agreements, and broken loyalties that had been building for decades in New York's underworld. A middle-aged man known around the neighborhood as Frankie Shots sat among familiar faces, unaware that control over his gambling and loan rackets had already been promised to others, and that somewhere above him, in the invisible hierarchy of the Italian-American mafia, his fate had been sealed. When gunfire shattered the night not long after, it was not just a life that ended. It was a signal, one that would help ignite a violent internal conflict inside the prophesied crime family and reshape organized crime in Brooklyn. To understand how a grocer's son became a pivotal figure in that world, we have to step back, long before that November night, into the crowded streets where his life began. Frank Abbatemarco's story starts, like that of so many Italian-American mobsters of his generation, in the great tidal wave of migration that transformed the United States around the turn of the 20th century. Between the 1880s and the First World War, millions of men and women left the southern regions of Italy, Campania, Calabria, Sicily, Basilicata, fleeing rural poverty, political instability, and a future that promised little beyond subsistence farming and backbreaking labor. Steamships from Naples and Palermo arrived in New York Harbor, packed with families who carried everything they owned in a few trunks, and who often spoke little or no English. Ellis Island processed them by the thousands, an industrial gateway to a country that promised opportunity but offered no guarantees. The Abbatemarco family was part of this human tide. Sources differ on some specifics, but most place Frank's birth around the end of the 19th century, in New York City, to parents who had only recently crossed the Atlantic. Their surname, common in parts of southern Italy, was one among many that filled the registers of tenement houses and parish churches in the new Italian enclaves. Like countless others, they settled where they could find work and where they could hear familiar dialects spoken in the streets. For the Abbatemarcos, that meant the working-class neighborhoods near the Brooklyn waterfront, areas like Red Hook and Carroll Gardens, where the docks dominated life and the line between survival and destitution was thin. The world that surrounded Frank as a child bore little resemblance to the romanticized images of early 20th century New York. Tenements were overcrowded, often lacking proper sanitation. Children slept 2 or 3 to a bed. Windows were rare commodities, privacy almost non-existent. Many Italian families faced open prejudice, dismissed in newspapers as undesirable, and depicted as innately criminal or unassimilable. Jobs for recent immigrants were grueling and poorly paid. Long days on construction sites, in sweatshops, or as casual labor on the docks, unloading freight under the watchful eye of gang foremen and pier bosses. For a boy growing up in that environment, the street was a classroom as powerful as any school. The Italian neighborhoods had their own internal structure, parish priests, mutual aid societies, neighborhood grocers, and local businessmen who extended small loans and favors when banks would not. But they also attracted more predatory figures. The older generation of Italian criminals practiced what was known as the Black Hand, a mix of extortion, intimidation, and kidnapping that preyed on the fears of fellow immigrants. Extortion letters, sometimes decorated with crude drawings of daggers or black hands, demanded payments from store owners and laborers under the threat of violence. Children like Frank would have heard stories of men who refused to pay and later found their shop windows shattered, or worse. Yet the world of crime was not simply something external that preyed on the community. In neighborhoods where factory wages could barely keep a family afloat, some young men saw in the local toughs an alternative route to respect and economic security. These were the early seeds of what would become the American Mafia, loose groups of Italian and Sicilian street gangs that provided a crude form of order in their neighborhoods, enforced through fear, but also through the distribution of favors and money. A boy who ran errands for such men, carrying messages, keeping watch on a street corner, delivering small packages, could, at a very young age, begin to glimpse the outlines of a different, illicit economy operating alongside the official one. There is little surviving documentation about Frank Abbatemarco's earliest years. Census records, police files, and later court proceedings confirm broad strokes rather than providing a detailed diary of his childhood. But taken together with the history of New York's Italian neighborhoods, they paint a plausible picture of his formative environment. Formal education for immigrant children often ended early. It was common for boys to leave school in their early teens to help support their families. Given the economic realities of the time, it is likely that Frank, too, was expected to contribute, perhaps taking odd jobs around the markets and docks, where the rhythms of legal and illegal commerce intertwined. The Brooklyn waterfront was its own world. Longshoremen gathered before dawn in shape-ups, hopping to be chosen for a day's work. Foremen and hearing bosses, many of them corrupt, used their power over employment to extract small payments or loyalty. Theft from cargo, stevedore pilferage, was widespread, with goods quietly disappearing from crates and holds. Some of those who oversaw this pilferage were connected to the emerging Italian and Irish criminal organizations that were beginning to dominate local rackets. A young man with an introduction to such circles might be invited to perform simple tasks in exchange for more money than a week's honest labor could provide. By the late 1910s and early 1920s, organized crime in New York was undergoing a transformation. The old Black Hand figures were being supplanted by more structured gangs that saw beyond simple extortion. One of the most powerful in Brooklyn was led by Francesco Isle, known as Frankie Yale, a Neapolitan gangster who built a lucrative empire based on protection rackets and later, bootlegging. Yale's influence extended across South Brooklyn, including neighborhoods where families like the Abbatemarcos lived. His men controlled certain bars, social clubs, and unions, and they demonstrated the power of criminal organization not just to inspire fear, but to command a kind of twisted admiration. They dressed better than the average dock worker, handed out cash on religious feast days, and intervened in local disputes when the official authorities were either absent or distrusted. It was in this world that Frank came of age. While the specific individuals he dealt with in his youth remain unknown, the structure of opportunity and temptation is well documented. For an ambitious young man from an immigrant background, the message was clear. The line between a hard, precarious life and one of relative comfort often ran straight through the doorways of neighborhood social clubs where bets were taken, deals were made, and the law was treated as an obstacle rather than a boundary. In 1920, the United States embarked on what would become one of the greatest unintended experiments in fostering organized crime, national prohibition. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages, transforming a vast, legal industry into a black market overnight. For established criminals and aspiring ones alike, this was an unprecedented opportunity. Ships laden with liquor were anchored off the coast. Trucks ferried cases of whiskey and wine into cities. Speakeasies sprang up in basements and back rooms. Control of this trade meant money, more money than the older generation of extortionists had ever dreamed of. Brooklyn was one of the main arteries through which illegal liquor flowed. The waterfront, with its hidden coves and freight facilities, provided ideal cover for smuggling operations. Italian gangs that had previously fought over small extortion scores began to compete for a piece of the bootlegging profits. While more research-oriented historians and law enforcement files give detailed accounts of the kingpins of this era, they are less precise about every lower-ranking figure. Frank Abbatemarco, not yet the mid-level boss he would become, would have been in his 20s as this new criminal economy took shape around him. Contemporary accounts of the neighborhood suggest that many young men of his age were drawn into the work, whether as drivers for liquor shipments, lookouts watching for police, or enforcers ensuring that small bars and saloons purchased their alcohol from the right supplier. Even as Prohibition fueled unprecedented profits, it also increased violence among gangs competing for territory. The 1920s in New York saw a series of gangland killings that, while often reported in heavily sensationalized fashion, did reflect a genuine escalation in organized criminal conflict. This was the same decade in which the young, ambitious Charles Lucky Luciano and his allies began to challenge the hold of more traditionalist bosses, setting in motion the changes that would later shape the entire structure of the American mafia. In Brooklyn, shootings between rival groups, Italian, Irish, Jewish, were no longer rare events. Newspapers chronicled them with a mixture of alarm and lurid fascination. Against this backdrop, men like Abbatemarco learned important lessons. Survival in the underworld was not simply about brutality. It was about knowing when to align with stronger factions, when to keep a low profile, and how to maintain a reputation as someone who could be relied upon to carry out tasks without attracting unnecessary attention. Later law enforcement summaries would portray him as a man who had mastered the art of operating in the shadowy middle, not a flamboyant gang leader who boasted to reporters, but a steady, calculating figure who ran money-making operations quietly, relying on networks of subordinates. The fall of Prohibition in 1933 did not spell the end of the criminal empires that had flourished during the dry years. By then, the profits had enabled figures like Luciano and his allies to reorganize Italian-American organized crime into something more durable, a set of families, each controlling certain territories and rackets, coordinated through what was often referred to as the Commission. Joseph Prophesy, a devoutly Catholic olive oil importer from Calabria, emerged as the officially recognized boss of one such family, based primarily in Brooklyn and parts of Queens. He specialized not in flashy violence, but in quiet, methodical control over gambling, loan sharking, and labor rackets. This new structure provided a clear ladder for advancement, and by the mid-1930s and 1940s, Frank Abbatemarco had found his place on it. FBI and NYPD intelligence files from the post-war years identify him as a significant figure in gambling operations in South Brooklyn, firmly attached to the Prophesy organization. His rise was not the story of a sudden leap to power, but of a gradual accumulation of responsibility in a criminal ecosystem that prized reliability and revenue generation. In an era when the public imagination focused on headline-grabbing names, he was part of the vast, often unseen machinery that kept the daily flow of illegal bets and high-interest loans moving. The heart of his influence lay in the numbers racket, also known as the policy game. This was a form of illegal lottery, enormously popular in working-class communities, including the very immigrant neighborhoods where he had grown up. Customers placed tiny bets, nickels, dimes, quarters, on three-digit combinations, dreaming of sudden wealth. The appeal was obvious to people whose wages left little room for savings or indulgence. Running such a lottery required organization. Bettors, writers to record wagers, runners to collect them, and bankers to hold the money and pay out winnings. By the time law enforcement began to take serious notice of him, Abbatemarco was no longer a low-level runner. He was one of the men believed to be controlling entire sections of this trade for the Prophesy family, turning a steady profit from the hopes of his neighbors. His early life, shaped by poverty, discrimination, and the visible success of older criminals in his community, had made such a trajectory possible, perhaps even predictable. The very forces that had pushed his parents to cross the ocean had, in their American form, helped push him into a world where law could be bent or ignored in pursuit of stability and status. Yet the choices he made were still choices. Other children from the same blocks became barbers, dock workers, or small shopkeepers who struggled within the rules. Frank joined the parallel system that operated outside them. By the middle of the 20th century, he had become exactly the kind of figure that concerned both local priests and federal agents. A man whose roots in the neighborhood gave him an aura of legitimacy, even as his income came from activities that quietly damaged the lives of the people who trusted him. Police officers who patrolled South Brooklyn in those years would later describe a world in which many residents knew who controlled the local betting and who could make a loan when the rent fell behind, yet few were willing to talk openly about it. Fear and dependence overlapped. In that zone of ambiguity, men like Abbatemarco thrived. The path from the crowded tenement rooms of his youth to the position of a trusted earner for the Prophesy family was neither a straight line nor a publicly documented one. It wound through the shifting terrain of New York's underworld, from the legacy of Black Hand extortion to the bootlegging bonanza of Prohibition, and into the more systematized, corporate-style mafia of the post-war years. By the time his name began appearing regularly in police reports and internal mafia lists, the boy who had watched the docks and alleys of Brooklyn was long gone, replaced by a middle-aged man whose life revolved around calculations of risk, profit, and loyalty. Yet the same forces that had fostered his rise contained the seeds of his downfall. The system that enriched him depended on strict internal discipline and the regular flow of tribute from lower-ranking figures up to the boss. As the post-war years progressed and the pressures on organized crime increased, from new federal laws, from more aggressive prosecutors, and from shifts in the drug trade, the margins for error narrowed. A man whose life had been built on navigating the gray zones of power would soon find that the room to maneuver was shrinking. The story of how those pressures converged on Frank Abbatemarco begins with the world that shaped him, but it would end, decades after his parents first stepped onto American soil, in that Brooklyn bar on a November night, when all of the quiet tensions of his era erupted into a few short bursts of gunfire. By the time the United States emerged from the turmoil of the Great Depression and Prohibition had been repealed, Frank Abbatemarco was no longer just another waterfront youth trying to piece together an income from odd jobs. He was in his 30s, part of a generation that had grown up alongside the consolidation of modern organized crime. The rough, improvisational gangs of his childhood had given way to more structured organizations. In Brooklyn, that meant the family led by Joseph Prophesy, whose power extended quietly through parishes, corner stores, trucking depots, and social clubs. Within that world, Abbatemarco had moved from the status of neighborhood associate into something closer to a permanent fixture, a man whose name was known in back rooms where cash changed hands and decisions were made out of public view. When national prohibition collapsed in 1933, the sudden end of bootlegging profits posed a challenge for every criminal group that had grown rich on alcohol. Some gangs had overreached, building operations that could not be sustained without the enormous margins that illegal liquor provided. The more adaptable figures turned to other rackets that promised steady, if less spectacular, income. Among these, the numbers game, also called the policy racket, was especially attractive. It required no large shipments, no fleets of trucks, and no bribed customs officials. It needed only a willing public and a tight-knit organization to keep the money flowing upward. For someone like Abbatemarco, shaped by the rhythms of the immigrant neighborhoods and the dockside economy, the numbers business fit neatly into the existing fabric of life. The numbers racket was ingeniously simple. Players chose a 3-digit number and placed tiny bets, often just a few cents, with local writers who worked out of candy stores, barber shops, or tenement apartments. The winning number was usually derived from publicly available figures, such as the total handle at a racing track or the daily volume on the stock exchange, so that players could be reassured the game was not openly rigged. The odds were firmly against them, but the appeal was powerful. For workers making modest wages, the idea that a dime might be transformed into a week's or even a month's pay provided a daily thrill of possibility. In the Italian neighborhoods of South Brooklyn, the game became part of the routine. Wagers were as common as cups of coffee. Behind the storefronts, however, the operation required discipline and hierarchy. Writers took the bets and recorded them in code. Runners collected the slips and cash. Higher-level figures, known as bankers, handled the pooled money and decided how much to lay off with other bankers to limit their exposure to large payouts. It was at this upper level, according to later police intelligence and informant testimony, that Frank Abbatemarco established himself. By the late 1930s and 1940s, he was identified by law enforcement as a man who controlled a significant slice of the policy business in Red Hook and the surrounding neighborhoods. The nickels and dimes of thousands of small bettors, funneled upward day after day, turned into a reliable stream of income for him, and above him, for the Prohibition family. It is impossible to pin down exactly when he first assumed the role of banker. The Underworld did not leave orderly paperwork, and contemporary news coverage often focused on the more flamboyant figures of the era. But the pattern that emerges from scattered police reports, court records, and later historical studies is consistent. When officers raided numbers operations in South Brooklyn, they often found low-level writers or runners. The men suspected of running the show, including Abbatemarco, rarely appeared on the scene. He had learned early on that staying physically distant from day-to-day transactions was one of the simplest ways to lessen personal risk. Money and instructions traveled through trusted intermediaries, and when arrests did occur, it was the street-level workers who faced immediate charges. This did not mean that he was invisible. To the people who lived and worked in his territory, he became a familiar presence. Like many mid-level mob figures of his generation, he blended legitimate and illegitimate roles. He was not a public celebrity, nor was he a cloistered recluse. Accounts from those years describe him moving through neighborhood bars and social clubs, exchanging greetings, listening more than speaking. He invested in or informally controlled small businesses that offered plausible covers for frequent cash transactions. A bar here, a candy store there, perhaps a modest office above a shop where men came and went throughout the day. These places provided him with the appearance of a local businessman, someone who belonged to the community and had a stake in its daily life. At home, he was not just a racketeer but a husband and father. He married and raised children, including at least 2 sons, Anthony and Louis, who would later become entangled in the same criminal world. The Abbatemarco household, like many Italian-American families of the time, likely observed church holidays, family gatherings, and the outward rituals of respectability. It is one of the persistent contradictions of organized crime in mid-century New York that men who orchestrated illegal gambling and loans at usurious interest rates often saw themselves as protectors of their own family's prospects. They invested in their children's clothing and schooling with money that had come from exploiting the hopes and desperation of their neighbors. As his role grew, so did his obligations. Membership or deep association with a crime family like Prohibition was never purely a matter of personal gain. The organization existed to channel money upward. Street-level workers paid a share to their immediate superiors. Crew leaders and bankers paid to their kaporjime. The kaporjime paid to the boss, and along the way, everyone expected a cut. In later testimony before authorities, informants would describe Prophesy as a leader who demanded regular dues and tributes from the men under him, likening the payments to a kind of private tax. For someone in Abbatemarco's position, responsible for a lucrative, steady racket, those expectations were high. His numbers business did not just support his own lifestyle, it underwrote the larger machinery of the family. The 1930s and 1940s were not an era in which such operations could proceed without interference. Law enforcement in New York was uneven but not entirely blind. Periodic crackdowns on illegal gambling targeted policy games, especially when public pressure mounted over corruption, or when ambitious prosecutors saw political benefit in confronting organized crime. Raids swept through storefronts. Writers and runners were arrested. Ledgers were seized. In the press, reporters used colorful language to describe these operations, speaking of policy rackets smashed and betting syndicates exposed, even when the underlying structures quickly reconstituted themselves. Abbatemarco's name surfaces in accounts of these efforts not as the man standing behind the cash drawer, but as someone police believed to be directing operations from behind the scenes. He was questioned, detained, and at times charged in connection with gambling investigations, though like many of his contemporaries, he showed a notable ability to avoid long prison sentences. Fines, suspended sentences, and short jail terms were treated as a cost of doing business. The real danger lay not in any single arrest, but in having his role publicly recognized in a way that would disrupt his value to the family or make him an intolerable liability. Meanwhile, the broader environment in which he operated was changing. The Great Depression had underlined both the fragility of working-class existence and the attraction of quick-money schemes. The Second World War then transformed the Brooklyn waterfront into a vital military logistics hub. Troops, munitions, and supplies flowed through the same piers where Abbatemarco and his contemporaries had once watched freighters unload cargo. The need for speed and efficiency in wartime shipping made authorities wary of labor unrest. In practice, this often meant tolerating existing power structures on the docks, including the influence of organized crime figures. While there is no clear evidence that Abbatemarco himself held formal sway over the Longshoremen's Union, he operated in a world where Prophesie's organization and other families sought to shape hearing and working conditions, using intimidation and bribery to maintain control. The wartime economy brought more money into the neighborhood, and the numbers game expanded alongside legitimate paychecks. Soldiers on leave, war plant workers, and dock laborers all became potential customers. After the war, when the country shifted back toward a peacetime footing, many of those habits persisted. Illegal gambling was so woven into daily life that it was sometimes spoken of almost casually, yet the impact on the community was not benign. Families who could least afford it poured small but regular amounts into games whose structure ensured that they would, on average, lose. The profits flowed upward, reinforcing the status of men like Abbatemarco, while also entangling them more deeply in a system that could not function without constant low-level harm to the people around them. Within the Prophesy organization, he was by then recognized as a dependable earner. Internal FBI and NYPD reports from the late 1940s and early 1950s, drawing on informants and surveillance, would later list him as a significant member of the family, often describing him as a captain or crew leader in South Brooklyn. That designation carried not only the authority to direct others, but also the responsibility to mediate disputes, collect debts, and ensure discipline among the men working under his umbrella. In an underworld that prized order as a way to reduce costly feuds, someone of his standing had to demonstrate firmness without provoking needless conflict. His reputation extended beyond the quiet notes in police files. In the gossip of the underworld, he became known by the nickname Frankie Shots, a moniker that surfaced in newspapers and law enforcement reports. The exact origin of the nickname remains uncertain. Some later retellings suggested it referred to his capacity for drinking. Others implied it had more to do with firearms. Whatever its source, the name underscored the fact that he was no longer merely Frank from the neighborhood, but a figure whose underworld identity was recognized in its own right. The post-war years also brought new kinds of scrutiny. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a growing public anxiety about organized crime led to high-profile investigations. The most famous were the Senate hearings chaired by Kefauver, which held televised sessions exploring gambling, racketeering, and the existence of a nationwide criminal syndicate. These hearings focused largely on nationally known figures and dramatic case studies, not on every mid-level operator, and Abbatemarco himself did not take the witness stand. But the atmosphere they created had consequences. Newspapers began writing more broadly about crime families, syndicates, and policy bankers, and local law enforcement agencies felt greater pressure to demonstrate results against such networks. In Brooklyn, this meant renewed campaigns against illegal betting and loans. Raids became more regular. Grand juries were convened. Investigators who had once treated the numbers game as a tolerable, if technically illegal, pastime now spoke of it as a key source of funds for more dangerous criminal enterprises. For operators like Abbatemarco, the strategies for survival grew more complex. It was no longer enough to keep distance from actual betting slips. Lawyers needed to be kept on retainer. Legitimate sources of income had to be documented to explain an otherwise inexplicable standard of living. The risk that informants might cooperate with authorities increased as law enforcement offered plea deals to lower-level participants in exchange for testimony. At the same time, the internal structure of the Prophesy family meant that success was a double-edged sword. A man who controlled a lucrative racket gained status, but he also attracted the attention of those above him, who might expect ever larger tributes. Prophesy himself maintained an image of piety and respectability, attending Mass and presenting charitable donations, but accounts from insiders portrayed him as unyielding in financial matters. He insisted that his men honor their obligations, regardless of whether raids, arrests, or changing neighborhood conditions made it harder to collect from bettors. In such an environment, the margin between satisfying the boss and funding one's own operations could become uncomfortably tight. It was during this period, the early 1950s, that a younger generation of ambitious street figures began to cross paths with Abbatemarco in more consequential ways. Among them were the Gallow brothers from Red Hook, Larry, Joey, and Albert. They were considerably younger than he was, products of the same streets but of a different post-war moment, more inclined toward brash displays and violence than the older, more conservative mobsters who had come up before them. Law enforcement sources and later biographical accounts agree that the brothers, at various points, worked under Abbatemarco's umbrella, helping to collect bets, enforce payments, and administer parts of the numbers racket in South Brooklyn. In practical terms, this arrangement benefited both sides, at least initially. The Gallow brothers gained access to a stable, established income stream and the protection of a recognized lieutenant within the Prophesy family. Abbatemarco gained energetic, ruthless subordinates who could expand his reach, intimidate reluctant payers, and manage day-to-day hassles that he, now in his 50s, might have preferred to avoid. The numbers business continued to generate substantial revenue, and with younger men handling much of the street-level activity, he could present himself more clearly as a middle-aged local figure whose main concerns, outwardly at least, involved family and community life. Yet the same dynamic contained latent tensions. The very traits that made the Gallow brothers useful, their ambition, their comfort with direct confrontation, also made them difficult to control indefinitely. They represented a shift in underworld culture, away from the quieter, more patient approach of men like Abbatemarco, and toward a more openly aggressive style that would come to characterize organized crime conflicts in the early 1960s. In the mid-1950s, those tensions were still largely submerged beneath the daily routines of collections, payoffs, and quiet meetings. But as law enforcement pressure increased and the demands from the top of the family remained constant, the financial and personal strain on figures like Abbatemarco deepened. By the middle of the decade, his life embodied the contradictions of the era. On the one hand, he was firmly established, a recognized earner with a structured operation, a family man of middle age whose face was known in the neighborhood. On the other hand, he was enmeshed in a system that tolerated no sustained shortfall in payments, no prolonged signs of weakness. Modest gambling raids could be shrugged off. A brief spell in custody could be managed. The real danger lay in falling behind on obligations to the family, or in being seen as unreliable by either superiors or subordinates. In a world where respect was measured in both money and perceived strength, any suggestion that a man was losing his grip could invite pressure from above and testing from below. The post-war prosperity that transformed much of America did not fundamentally change those rules in the underworld. It merely raised the stakes, increasing both the potential profits and the costs of failure. As the 1950s advanced, the balance that Frank Abbatemarco had maintained for so long, between the appearance of community respectability and the realities of organized criminal enterprise, would come under strain from multiple directions at once. The habits formed in his youth, the networks he had built across decades, and the reputation he had cultivated as Frankie Shots would all be tested in ways that neither he nor those around him could fully foresee, even as they continued day by day to collect bets and count the money that flowed through their hands. In the Brooklyn that surrounded Frank Abbatemarco in the middle of the 1950s, the landscape itself was beginning to shift. The old waterfront neighborhoods where he had grown up were under pressure from post-war redevelopment projects. Highways carved through sections of the borough. Housing projects rose where rows of tenements had once stood. The docks, still active, were no longer the unquestioned heartbeat of the local economy, but they remained a place where cash, cargo, and quiet deals flowed in patterns invisible to outsiders. In Red Hook and the adjoining streets of South Brooklyn, the Italian-American community that had taken root in the early 20th century was passing from one generation to the next. The men who had come over on the ships were aging. Their American-born sons and grandsons now filled the bars, union halls, and social clubs. For that younger generation, the world seemed at once more open and more constrained. The GI Bill had opened doors to education for some, and factories and offices were hearing more broadly than during the lean years between the wars. But for others, especially those whose schooling had ended early or who felt blocked by prejudice and limited connections, the familiar structures of the street still offered the clearest route to money and status. It was into this generational mix that the Gallow brothers stepped, and through them, the world around Frank Abbatemarco began to tilt. Larry Joey and Albert Gallow were not the only tough young men in Red Hook, but they quickly gained a reputation that set them apart. Hard-edged, quick to take offense, and uninterested in the quieter, more deferential style preferred by older mobsters, they moved through the neighborhood with a kind of restless energy. Local police soon learned their names, linking them to a string of arrests connected to gambling, shakedowns, and street violence, even if many of those cases did not result in convictions. To the residents of the area, the brothers represented both a source of danger and, for some, a perverse form of protection. They were loud where earlier figures like Abbatemarco had been soft-spoken. They preferred confrontation to quiet negotiation. Frank's place in this evolving picture was ambiguous. Older than the Gallows by a generation, he had grown up in an era when discretion was both a survival skill and a point of pride. Now he found himself relying on men whose instincts ran in the opposite direction. Yet from a business perspective, their partnership made sense. The Gallow brothers, with their fearlessness and willingness to push hard on reluctant debtors or competitors, became key enforcers and organizers within the numbers operations that Abbatemarco controlled in Red Hook and neighboring districts. They oversaw riders and runners, physically collected the day's take, and made sure that those who owed money understood the consequences of delay. Law enforcement and later historical accounts consistently place Abbatemarco at the top of this local pyramid. He was widely believed to be a formal member of the Prophesy family, possibly holding the rank of Capwargine, or captain, in charge of a crew based in South Brooklyn. The men immediately below him, including the Gallows and other associates, were responsible for converting the community's appetite for small wagers and informal loans into organized revenues. Whoever placed a bet in that territory, whether they knew his name or not, was contributing to the stream of money that eventually landed on his table, and above him on Joseph Prophesy. For several years, this arrangement held together. Prophesy, operating from his own base in Brooklyn and Queens, remained out of the public eye, preferring to cultivate an image as a devout Catholic businessman. He made donations to churches, sponsored religious festivals, and appeared to live modestly on the profits from his olive oil importing firm. Behind that image, he presided over a family heavily invested in gambling, loan sharking, and labor rackets. Men like Abbatemarco were essential to this system. Each month, they were expected to deliver a fixed share of their earnings, a form of tribute that sustained the leadership and demonstrated loyalty. The 1950s, however, were not a static decade for organized crime. While local dynamics shaped life in Brooklyn, national events began to intrude in ways that neither Prophesy nor his subordinates could ignore. The most dramatic jolt came in November 1957, in a small town in upstate New York called Apalachin. There, state troopers stumbled upon a gathering of dozens of high-ranking mafia figures from across the country. The meeting, hastily broken up as mobsters fled into the surrounding woods and fields, shattered the long-maintained fiction that there was no national coordination among Italian-American crime families. Photographs of well-dressed men being herded into police cars made headlines, and legislators seized on the event as proof that a powerful, hidden network existed beneath the surface of American life. Joseph Prophesy attended the Apalachin meeting. His presence there would later be confirmed in law enforcement records. When the gathering was raided, he, like many others, tried to escape. Although he did not face major immediate legal consequences from that single event, the fallout was significant. Federal and state authorities, embarrassed at having been caught by surprise, began to take organized crime more seriously. New investigative units were formed. Prosecutors were encouraged to pursue broader conspiracy cases rather than just isolated gambling or assault charges. The press, newly energized, started to write about crime families and bosses in more concrete terms. The atmosphere surrounding people like Prophesy and his captains became more charged. In practical terms, this meant more raids, more investigations, and more expenses. Lawyers had to be retained, bail money needed to be on hand, fines and legal fees piled up. It also meant that the top leadership sought reassurance that the money pipeline from the streets remained secure. If anything, the pressure on earners increased. For someone like Abbatemarco, who oversaw a territory with a long-established numbers operation, this translated into higher expectations from above at a time when the environment on the ground was becoming more difficult. The challenges were not only legal. The same social changes that altered the physical landscape of Brooklyn were affecting the base of his business. Some long-time residents were moving out of the old blocks, replaced by new groups with different patterns of work and recreation. Competitors, sensing opportunity, tried to encroach on profitable corners or offer slightly better odds. Raids disrupted operations. Riders and runners became more cautious, sometimes quitting rather than risk repeated arrests. Collecting from debtors grew more complicated when surveillance increased and police pressure made overt intimidation riskier. Multiple later accounts, drawn from informant testimony and internal law enforcement analyses, agree that by the late 1950s, Frank Abbatemarco had fallen behind on his payments to Prophesy. Estimates of the exact amount vary, but a widely cited figure is around $50,000, a substantial sum at the time, especially when one considers that it represented not the gross intake of his operations, but the share expected to be passed upward after expenses and local distributions were covered. Whether the shortfall developed gradually, over months, or appeared more abruptly as a result of a particular series of setbacks is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the gap between what he was supposed to send and what he was actually able or willing to deliver became a serious concern. To the upper echelons of a family like Prophesie's, such a debt signaled more than just bad luck. The system functioned on a combination of fear and trust, fear that disobedience would be punished, and trust that capable earners would keep money flowing, no matter the circumstances. A captain who came up short risked being seen as either incompetent or disloyal. In that sense, the numbers on a ledger spoke to deeper questions about character and allegiance. For a man like Abbatemarco, whose standing rested on decades of service and steady revenue, the emergence of a large, lingering arrears was particularly ominous. Faced with this situation, he did not simply disappear or abandon his responsibilities. Accounts from within the underworld suggest that he tried to negotiate more time, appealing to intermediaries within the family structure. Consigliere and higher-ranking capos often served as channels through which disputes could be aired and resolved before resorting to drastic measures. It is likely that meetings took place in back rooms and private homes, where Frank explained that raids, competition, or changing neighborhood conditions had cut into his profits, and that he needed temporary relief or a reduction in his required payments. Such pleas rarely found a sympathetic hearing from bosses like Prophesy, who were accustomed to hearing excuses from men seeking to protect their own share. From the leadership's perspective, granting leniency to one captain risked setting a precedent that others might exploit. There was also the question of appearances. If word spread that Frankie Shots had complained about his tribute and been rewarded with a discount, it might encourage murmurs of defiance in other corners of the family. Even if a boss understood the real difficulties on the ground, he had to calculate the broader impact of any concession. At the same time, Abbatemarco was under pressure from below. His own men expected to be paid. The Gallow brothers in particular were not inclined to accept a reduced share quietly. Their risks were increasing. They were more visible to the police, more frequently named in investigative reports, and so their expectations rose as well. To keep them motivated and cooperative, he had to maintain a flow of money that reflected the dangers they faced. Squeezed between the demands of his boss and the restlessness of his crew, he occupied a narrowing space. The strain this created is evident in the way his name began to appear more regularly in intelligence files. Detectives noted that he was under scrutiny not only as a gambling figure, but as someone whose relationships inside the Prophesy family seemed to be under some kind of stress. Informants, always eager to interpret underworld signals for their handlers, reported that Frank was complaining more openly about the financial burdens placed on him, grumbling that years of faithful service had not earned him any slack. Whether these reports captured his real tone or were colored by the biases of the informants is impossible to say with certainty, but they fed into a growing perception that he was not at ease. Some later narratives, written decades after the fact, would go further, suggesting that Abbatemarco considered the unthinkable, shifting his allegiance to another family. According to these accounts, he may have sounded out rivals of Prophesy, hinting that he might bring his numbers operation under their protection if he could secure better terms. Such claims, while widely repeated, are difficult to verify conclusively. No surviving official document records such a conversation, and the posthumous reputations of mobsters are often shaped by stories that conflate rumor with fact. What can be said is that in the tightly controlled world of mid-century organized crime, even the suggestion that a captain might be entertaining such thoughts would have been enough to mark him as dangerously unreliable in the eyes of his boss. More concrete is the role of the Gallow brothers during this period. They were, by the late 1950s, heavily involved in administering Abbatemarco's numbers racket. Their own ambitions extended beyond serving as enforcers for an older man. They watched the flow of cash through the system, saw how much was skimmed at each level, and resented the portions that disappeared into the hands of people they rarely saw. To them, the tribute sent to Prophesy seemed less like a legitimate charge for protection and more like a burden imposed by an out-of-touch leadership. Because much of their immediate experience of the boss came through the demands that filtered down from above, they developed a view of Prophesy as excessively greedy. At the same time, their relationship with Abbatemarco was complex. On one level, he was their superior, the man whose name carried weight with higher-ups and who had brought them into a significant earning opportunity. On another level, they regarded him as a representative of an older, cautious generation that they believed lacked the nerve to push for better terms or to expand more aggressively. When he complained about being squeezed, they heard not just legitimate grievances, but also an admission that the system as it stood was unsustainable for them as well. Their frustrations with the family's financial demands and their sense that they were not receiving their fair share of the profits began to merge. This convergence of pressures, legal, financial, and generational, left Abbatemarco in a precarious position. Unlike some impulsive younger figures who responded to stress with immediate, visible defiance, he continued to try to manage his way through. He borrowed where he could, juggled payouts, and sought to keep everyone at least partially satisfied. Superiors paid enough to avoid immediate reprisal, subordinates given enough to hold their loyalty, and law enforcement kept at bay through discretion and occasional sacrifice of expendable underlings. But each of these strategies had limits. Loans came with their own interest and obligations. Men like the Gallows interpreted any delay or shortfall as a sign of weakness. More intense surveillance by police made traditional evasive tactics less reliable. To outward appearances, he maintained his routine. He could still be found in familiar bars and social clubs, drinking coffee, talking quietly with acquaintances, sometimes seen walking the streets with his hands in his pockets, a middle-aged man who might have been any small businessman in the neighborhood. At home, he was a husband and father, present at family meals and milestones, a figure of stability whose children knew him less as a mob figure than as the man who kept the household running. The duality of his life, always present, became sharper as the risks stacked up around him. The same neighborhood that provided the clientele for his numbers game now also supplied the rumors that fueled law enforcement interest and internal distrust. By 1959, the unresolved debt to Prophesy had become more than a bookkeeping problem. It was a symbol of a deeper breakdown in the relationship between a long-serving captain and the family's leadership. The exact conversations that took place in those final months are lost to history, preserved only in fragments of informant reports and the recollections of other mobsters who spoke years later. But their outlines suggest a man caught between conflicting imperatives, trying without success to reconcile his past loyalty with his present inability, or unwillingness, to meet the financial demands placed upon him. In that space of uncertainty, suspicion flourished, suspicion from above that he might be skimming or hedging his bets, and suspicion from below that he no longer had the strength or influence to protect his men. The world that had once rewarded his careful, methodical approach was closing in. Old accommodations were harder to maintain. Old reputations carried less weight. Inside the Prophesy family, whispers about Frankie Shots shifted in tone, turning from respect to questions about whether he had lost his touch. On the Brooklyn streets where his number slips still circulated, most people placing their daily bets had no idea that the man at the top of their local pyramid was standing on increasingly fragile ground. They handed over their nickels and dimes, looking for a bit of luck, unaware that behind the scenes, a conflict over much larger sums and far higher stakes was nearing a critical point. In the weeks after Frank Abbatemarco's killing, the streets of South Brooklyn settled back into their familiar rhythms more quickly than an outsider might imagine. Shopkeepers opened their doors each morning, longshoremen trudged toward the piers before dawn, and the hum of neighborhood talk returned to the usual topics of work, family, and local gossip. Yet beneath that surface calm, something fundamental had shifted. The quiet presence that had anchored the numbers racket in Red Hook and the surrounding blocks for years was gone, and the question of who would truly control the flow of gambling money, and under what terms, was no longer theoretical. On paper, the answer seemed straightforward. The Gallow brothers and their associates, already deeply enmeshed in the day-to-day operations of Abbatemarco's policy bank, stepped fully into the vacuum. Writers and runners who had once considered themselves Frank's people now reported to the Gallow crew. If a shopkeeper wanted to keep taking bets in the back room, he dealt with the same faces, but it was clear that the ultimate authority behind them had changed. The daily totals of the numbers play, carefully tallied and collected, were now delivered to a new central point. From the perspective of Joseph Prophesy and his inner circle, this transition should have preserved the core of the business. In their view, the racket belonged to the family, not to any single man. Whether the local banker was named Abbatemarco or Gallow, the expectation remained that a fixed share of the profits would travel upward, just as they had for years. The removal of a debtor was supposed to restore order. A fresh, energetic crew would take over, shake loose any lingering reluctance on the street, and ensure that the boss once again received what he believed was his due. But the Gallow brothers did not share the older generation's assumptions. To them, the murder of Frankie Shots had been more than a disciplinary measure handed down from above. It was an act they themselves had allegedly driven, or at least facilitated, at considerable risk. They had watched Abbatemarco struggle under what they regarded as unreasonable financial demands. They had seen how much money the numbers game could produce, and how little of it made its way back to the men who actually enforced and organized it. Now, with the policy bank effectively in their hands, they were unwilling to simply replicate the same arrangement. Instead of treating the takeover as a temporary custodianship on the boss's behalf, they behaved as if they had inherited a prize. The tribute they sent to Prophesy did not match the portions he had long extracted from Abbatemarco. Some money went upward, enough to maintain a formal show of loyalty and to avoid an immediate confrontation, but a greater share remained closer to the street. The Gallows used it to reinforce their own power, paying their core crew more generously, rewarding informally allied shopkeepers, and expanding their influence in nearby blocks. The numbers racket that had once been a secure conduit to the boss's coffers became, in practice, a financial base for a semi-autonomous faction. Under different circumstances, this might have unfolded more slowly, with months or years of complaints and negotiations before coming to a head. But the broader context of the late 1950s and early 1960s accelerated everything. Law enforcement interest in organized crime was rising. Robert F. Kennedy, first as chief counsel to the Senate's Labor Rackets Committee, and then as Attorney General under his brother's presidency, had made the mafia a particular focus. His staff collected intelligence, compiled charts of family structures, and pushed federal agencies to cooperate more systematically against racketeering. Although these efforts were still in their early stages, they added another layer of stress to an already tense internal situation. Within Brooklyn, detectives and federal agents were hearing more, not less, about the Prophesy family in the wake of Apalachin and Abbatemarco's murder. Informants spoke of dissatisfaction among younger associates, of complaints that the boss was both greedy and remote. The name Gallow began to appear more frequently in intelligence files, sometimes accompanied by the term hot-headed or reckless. When these reports mentioned Frank's former territory, it was often to note that the men now running his numbers operation did not seem inclined to follow the old pattern of quiet obedience. For Abbatemarco's immediate family, the months after his death were a period of disorienting adjustment. His wife, who had for years run the household and watched her husband's comings and goings without necessarily knowing every detail of his business, now had to manage without his income or his guidance. Their sons, adult men by this time, found themselves pulled more deeply into the currents their father had navigated for decades. Contemporary sources name at least two of those sons, Anthony and Louis, as later being involved in the same world of gambling and racketeering that had defined their father's public identity. Accounts of their reaction to his murder are necessarily indirect. There were no public statements, no interviews in which they explained their feelings or intentions. But given the codes and loyalties of the milieu in which they lived, it is reasonable to assume that they did not simply accept the official silence. The general understanding on the street that the Gallow crew had been responsible, acting with prophesized blessing, would have shaped their sense of who had benefited and who bore moral responsibility. At the same time, they were not free agents. Whatever their private anger, they had to position themselves in relation to the emerging power blocks inside the family. Some later narratives suggest that the Abbatemarco sons came to see the Gallows less as their father's executioners, and more as the only viable counterweight to the boss they blamed for placing him under unbearable financial pressure. By this reading, the resentment that might have been directed at the young crew who had taken over their father's racket instead focused on the older leadership that had insisted on unsparing tribute in the first place. Whether or not specific conversations supporting this interpretation can be documented, the observable outcome aligns with it. The sons did not become avowed defenders of the prophesy regime. In the years to come, figures bearing the Abbatemarco name surfaced more often on the side of those who challenged the old order than among those who defended it. Inside the prophesy family, the fault lines were therefore not neatly arranged along generational lines alone. Age mattered, but so did personal history, local alliances, and the immediate calculus of risk and reward. Some older figures sympathized with complaints about the boss's financial policies but saw open rebellion as suicidal. Younger men, emboldened by the example of the Gallows and angered by the visible disparities in wealth and influence, were more willing to consider drastic measures. The killing of Frankie Shots, a man widely regarded as a solid, unflashy earner, became a cautionary tale invoked on both sides. To the loyalists, it demonstrated that prophesy would not hesitate to discipline those who failed to pay. To the dissenters, it showed that service and loyalty offered little protection when a boss decided that someone had outlived his usefulness. Tensions simmered throughout 1960. Publicly, the prophesy family presented a united front. There were no press conferences, no manifestos, no visible break in the pattern of social club gatherings, religious procession donations, or routine underworld business. But law enforcement intelligence reports from this period, drawing on unnamed sources inside the organization, speak of rising grumbling, particularly in South Brooklyn. The core complaint was familiar: money. The men running the old Abbatemarco policy bank believed that the proportions demanded by the leadership left them with too little to cover their risks and expand their influence. They felt, in effect, that they were being used to subsidize the lifestyles of a small group of older bosses who faced fewer immediate dangers from the police. Early in 1961, the simmering discontent boiled over into an unprecedented act. On a winter day that would later be carefully reconstructed in investigative files and journalistic accounts, a group led by the Gallow brothers kidnapped several top figures in the prophesy hierarchy. Among those seized were Joseph Prophesy himself, his underboss Joseph Magliacco, and other senior men closely associated with the administration. They were lured to a supposedly routine meeting or social occasion, and then confronted by armed men who made it clear that the normal rules of deference had been suspended. The captives were held in secluded locations in and around Brooklyn. There were no public ransom demands in the ordinary sense. The terms being pressed were internal ones. The kidnappers wanted changes to the financial structure of the family, reductions in tribute, greater autonomy over lucrative rackets, and perhaps, implicitly, a redistribution of power away from the older Calabrian leadership toward the younger, street-hardened faction centered in Red Hook. The exact wording of the demands has not survived in a verbatim record, but later accounts by mobsters and informants agree on the basic thrust: money, control, and relief from what they considered exploitation. For the underworld, this was an extraordinary breach of convention. Internal disputes, even violent ones, were expected to follow certain unwritten guidelines. Kidnapping the boss and his top aides crossed a line that many older mafiosi considered almost sacrilegious. It exposed the leadership to humiliation and risked drawing intense law enforcement attention to the very figures who had until then managed to stay largely in the shadows. But it also revealed the depth of the gallows, anger, and their sense that ordinary channels for negotiation were closed to them. The immediate outcome of the crisis was, on the surface, de-escalatory. Under the pressure of the situation, understandings were reportedly reached. According to several later sources, Prophesy agreed to make certain concessions, at least on paper: promises of reduced payments, new arrangements about who would control specific rackets, and assurances that no retaliation would be taken against those who had staged the kidnapping. The hostages were eventually released unharmed. For a brief moment, it seemed as if a radical act of defiance had forced changes that years of quiet grumbling had failed to achieve. But this appearance did not last. Once free and out of immediate danger, Prophesy moved to reassert his authority. From his perspective, he had been subjected to an intolerable insult. To simply accept the new terms as a fait accompli would have been, in the logic of organized crime, an invitation to further challenges. He began quietly planning a response, not through open decrees or public statements, but by authorizing trusted enforcers to regain control through targeted violence. Among those tasked with this effort were loyalists like Carmine Persico, a rising figure with a reputation for toughness and reliability. Their mission was to eliminate the core of the rebellious faction, starting with the Gallow brothers, and to reestablish the principle that the boss, not his subordinates, set the terms of business. The years of internal discipline and relative calm that had marked much of the Prophesy family's earlier history gave way to something newer and more dangerous: an internal war. The first major counterstrike came later in 1961. Larry Gallow, regarded as one of the brains of the rebel group, was lured to what he believed was a peace meeting at a bar. The setting was familiar: dim lights, drinks on the table, the sort of backroom where underworld disagreements were addressed. Instead of reconciliation, he found an ambush. Several men attacked him, attempting to strangle him. The struggle spilled over as he fought for his life, and the incident became chaotic enough that police, alerted by bystanders, intervened. Larry survived, though injured, and the unfinished nature of the attack only hardened the resolve of his crew. The failed ambush of Larry Gallow marked the point at which the conflict could no longer be contained within the delicate, largely invisible mechanisms of mafia dispute resolution. A tit-for-tat cycle began. Shootings and beatings, once rare within the tightly controlled Prophesy ranks, became more frequent. Some were carried out in semi-public spaces, streets, bars, parked cars, where the risk of drawing attention was higher. Newspapers took notice, drawing lines between these incidents and the earlier kidnapping of the boss. What had once been dismissed by some commentators as overblown tales of crime syndicates now appeared in the stark form of real bodies and real arrests. Throughout this escalating feud, the shadow of Frank Abbatemarco's murder remained visible. His former territory, with its lucrative numbers trade, was one of the main prizes at stake. The profits from his old policy bank helped fund the Gallow faction's operations and strengthened their ability to recruit and reward allies. The resentment over the way he had been treated, pressured for money until his debt was considered unforgivable, then eliminated, became part of the narrative the rebels told about themselves. They portrayed their struggle not only as a fight for money, but as a revolt against what they depicted as unjust, parasitic leadership. The Abbatemarco name itself did not vanish from police or underworld records. His sons and other relatives found themselves inevitably drawn into the struggles of the early 1960s, sometimes as active participants, sometimes simply as men forced to choose sides in a war they had not started. Arrest logs and investigative memoranda from this period show them being questioned, surveilled, or in some cases charged in connection with gambling and related offenses. To law enforcement, they were both individuals and symbols, living reminders of a murdered numbers boss whose fate had become a pivot around which the subsequent conflict turned. Officially, Frank's own homicide case slipped further into the background as more urgent crises claimed investigators' attention. No one was ever convicted of his killing. The detectives who had worked the file moved on to other assignments. The bar where he died continued to operate under different owners. Time blurred some of the details in witnesses' memories. What remained, in documents and in the recollections of those who had known him, was a pattern. A man who had built a profitable racket within the framework of a criminal family, who fell into fatal debt to his boss, and whose elimination failed to solve the very problem it had been meant to address. Outside the closed world of the mafia, the early 1960s brought further scrutiny of the patterns of extortion and gambling that underpinned much of its power. Investigations into labor racketeering on the Brooklyn waterfront, spearheaded in part by Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, revealed the extent to which illegal gambling, loan sharking, and union corruption were intertwined. While those investigations did not focus exclusively on the legacy of any one man, the structures they exposed looked very much like the world that had sustained Abbatemarco for decades. A world in which everyday economic life was subtly but persistently shaped by the presence of men who enforced their own rules alongside, and sometimes in place of, the law. For the neighborhoods where he had lived and operated, the long-term consequences were mixed. The numbers game survived increased law enforcement pressure, albeit in more cautious forms. New faces emerged to replace the old, some less rooted in the original immigrant experience that had shaped figures like Frankie Shots. Urban renewal projects, highway construction, and demographic shifts altered the character of the streets where he had once walked. Yet older residents, interviewed years later, still remembered him, not as a glamorous gangster, but as a local man whose quiet authority and violent end encapsulated the dangers of the shadow economy that ran beneath their daily lives. In the end, the arc of Frank Abbatemarco's life and death traced a full circle through the history of 20th-century organized crime in New York. Born into a poor immigrant community, he rose by mastering the underworld's logic of risk, profit, and loyalty. He built a steady business in illegal gambling, navigating between the needs of his neighbors and the demands of his superiors. When the balance tipped, when legal pressure, competition, and unyielding tribute requirements converged, he became expendable. His removal, intended as a demonstration of the boss's power, helped instead to destabilize the very family that had once relied on his quiet efficiency. The war that followed, with its kidnappings, attempted stranglings, and eruptions of violence, was fought over many things: money, pride, generational change, and competing visions of how a crime family should be run. But woven through its beginnings was the story of the debt-burdened numbers banker from Red Hook, whose life and business had shown both the possibilities and the brutal limits of that world. long before his name became shorthand in underworld gossip for a debt gone wrong and a killing in a Brooklyn bar. Frank Abbatemarco was already a familiar figure in the files of the New York City Police Department. His official life exists today not in a single coherent biography, but in fragments: arrest reports, surveillance notes, grand jury minutes, and clipped newspaper articles folded into manila folders. Taken together, they trace the outline of a man who spent decades walking the line between everyday neighborhood respectability and a persistent, documented involvement in illegal gambling. His earliest appearances in those records, like those of many lower-ranking mob figures, were relatively minor. In the 1930s and 1940s, when the numbers racket was booming across the city, periodic police campaigns targeted the most visible parts of the operation: the storefront drops, the street riders, the apartment back rooms where slips were tallied. Raids would sweep through a cluster of addresses on a given day, yielding arrests for bookmaking or operating a policy game. The sums involved were, by later standards, modest: rolls of small bills, ledgers filled with nickels and dimes. But the pattern was clear enough. Each time one of these sweeps made the newspapers, the accompanying stories named a handful of men suspected of being more than just pawns. Abbatemarco's name surfaced among them from time to time, tied to gambling charges that rarely resulted in lengthy imprisonment, but that established him in the police imagination as a habitual, professional offender. The legal consequences of those early arrests reflected the limits of the system confronting him. Judges, faced with crowded dockets and laws that treated policy and bookmaking as misdemeanors or low-level felonies, often imposed fines or short sentences. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were ordinary men scraping by, that gambling was a victimless vice popular among working people. For someone like Frank, these encounters with the law became a kind of occupational hazard, costs to be folded into the calculations of running a profitable racket. If he served time, it was brief. More often, he paid money and returned to the neighborhood, a little more cautious but fundamentally undeterred. As he moved up from street-level activity to a supervisory role, his direct exposure lessened, even as his name remained in the background of more cases. When police raided a candy store and arrested a writer, the man at the cash register might insist he answered only to a local runner. Yet in the notes detectives scribbled afterward, there would sometimes be a line, believed to be part of Abbatemarco operation, or take to Frankie Shots. These notations rarely found their way into formal indictments, but they show how, in the eyes of enforcement, he had become a fixed point in the underground map of Red Hook's gambling economy. By the 1950s, as public concern about organized crime rose, the attention given to that map increased. The Kefauver Committee's televised hearings of 1950-51 brought the language of syndicates and rackets into living rooms across the country. Senators questioned gamblers, bookmakers, and mid-level mob figures about how illegal betting operations worked, who took the largest share of the profits, and how political and police corruption shielded these businesses from serious disruption. The names most often repeated in those hearings belonged to nationally prominent bosses and flamboyant gamblers in cities like Chicago and Las Vegas. But the structural portrait the committee drew of a pyramid of illegal gambling, with neighborhood figures at the base and crime families skimming profits at the top, fit closely with the world in which Abbatemarco operated. Within New York, these hearings had a feedback effect. Local prosecutors and police commanders, anxious not to appear soft on organized crime, ordered more sustained campaigns against betting. The old habit of occasional, symbolic raids was supplemented by efforts to map out who, exactly, controlled the money behind them. Now, when detectives compiled lists of suspected policy bankers in Brooklyn, they did so with more care, knowing that their superiors, and perhaps even federal agencies, might examine the results. In one such list, assembled in the mid-1950s and later cited by historians, Frank's name appeared as a key figure in South Brooklyn's numbers racket, his role described succinctly. Policy banker, Red Hook Presidency. Area, believed connected to Prophesy Group. The passage of the federal organized crime control statutes that would later provide powerful tools against racketeering was still years away. But the mindset that produced them was taking shape. The FBI, long reluctant to focus heavily on the mafia, began in 1958 to implement what it called the Top Hoodlum program, instructing field offices to identify and monitor the most significant local organized crime figures. In New York, this meant creating dedicated files not only on bosses like Prophesy, but also on capos and major earners beneath them. As a result, Abbatemarco's paper trail shifted subtly. The sporadic local arrest records were now complemented by federal memoranda noting his associations, addresses, vehicles, and movements. These reports did not present him as a glamorous outlaw. They described a middle-aged man of ordinary appearance, often in conservative clothing, moving between a cluster of known meeting places, bars on President Street, social clubs off Columbia Street, apartments above small shops. Agents jotted down license plate numbers, the times he arrived and left, and the faces he was seen with. Among those faces, as the decade wore on, were an increasing number of younger men with their own growing reputations, the Gallow brothers prominent among them. Surveillance logs that once mentioned Frank A. as a principal slowly began to list him alongside newer names that would later dominate headlines. If the law saw him as a recurring problem, the neighborhood's view was more ambiguous. Residents who grew up in Red Hook during the 1940s and 1950s, interviewed later by journalists and sociologists, often recalled Frankie Shots as a quiet, solid presence rather than a swaggering tough. Some spoke of him as someone who could be approached in times of trouble, who might advance money for a rent payment or intervene if a landlord or employer was, in their view, being unreasonable. Others remembered the unspoken pressure that surrounded his operations, the way certain men watched corners when bets were being taken, the fear that if a person fell too far behind on payments, unseen consequences would follow. Clergy in the area, particularly priests serving Italian parishes, wrestled with their own response to men like Abbatemarco. On the one hand, they ministered to families that depended, directly or indirectly, on the income his rackets provided. On the other, they saw the damage that chronic gambling and high-interest loans wrought in the lives of the poorest parishioners. Parish bulletins from the era occasionally contained warnings against playing the numbers, or seeking help from men who exploit your misfortune, thinly veiled references to the local policy bankers and loan sharks. Yet these admonitions seldom named names. The influence of figures like Frank was strong enough, and the fear they commanded real enough, that many community leaders thought it wiser to speak in generalities. Social workers and reformers, especially those connected to nascent anti-crime campaigns, took a somewhat more direct line. In studies of Brooklyn's waterfront neighborhoods conducted in the 1950s, researchers noted the extent to which illegal gambling had become normalized. They cited examples of families devoting a small but regular share of their income to daily number bets, even when struggling with rent or food costs. In their analysis, the Abbatemarcos of the city were not rogue exceptions, but central actors in a parallel economy that drained resources from already marginal communities. This view stood in contrast to the romanticized image some held of the local fixer, who kept order and shared his wealth. It emphasized instead the quiet, accumulated harm embedded in what many treated as routine. In this tension between neighborhood memory and analytical critique, Frank's reputation took on a double character. For those who knew him personally, he was the local man who had made it, who could buy rounds at the bar without worrying about the tab, who dressed a little better and walked with the assurance that comes from recognized status. For those compiling data, he was one more node in an exploitative system, his personal charm or reserve irrelevant to the broader pattern. These two perspectives would continue to shape how later generations understood him, as both the product of a specific community context and as an example of the impersonal machinery of organized crime. After his death, his FBI and NYPD files did not simply close. They were updated to reflect the homicide, cross-referenced with new reports on the Gallow prophesy conflict, and mined for insights into how such a long-serving earner could have ended up on the wrong side of an internal reckoning. For federal officials like Robert Kennedy and his staff, cases like Abbatemarco's were instructive. They demonstrated that the so-called families were not abstract entities, but networks held together by money and fear, in which even high-ranking participants could be swiftly removed if their financial performance faltered or if they appeared disloyal. Internal Justice Department memoranda from the early 1960s, while not always mentioning him by name, used examples like his to argue that any serious attack on organized crime had to focus on the flow of illegal funds and the coercive power it underwrote. The shadow of his life also extended forward through his relatives. In the 1960s and 1970s, law enforcement encountered other men bearing the Abbatemarco surname in the course of gambling and racketeering investigations. Some were explicitly identified as his sons or close kin. They appeared on wiretaps discussing bets, in arrest records tied to policy or loans, and in informant reports as participants in one or another factional struggle. While each man's path was his own, the recurrence of the name in such contexts underscored how deeply the family had become entwined with the underworld economy their patriarch had helped build. For criminologists and historians who later studied mid-century organized crime, his career offered a useful case study in the life cycle of a mid-level mafia figure. He was not a boss whose pronouncements shaped national syndicate policy, nor a flamboyant outlaw whose exploits filled front pages. Instead, he exemplified the vast middle tier, the earners who translated abstract control of a territory into daily cash through 1,000 small interactions. His rise illustrated how such men could leverage local knowledge and community ties to create durable illegal enterprises. His fall showed the vulnerability that came with depending on a rigid hierarchy that saw them as replaceable components. In this sense, the official record and the neighborhood memory converge on a common truth. Frank Abbatemarco's importance lay less in any single spectacular event than in the steady, grinding work of running an illegal business over decades. The same patience and caution that had once protected him could not, in the end, shield him when the pressures of law enforcement, competition, and internal tribute demands converged. The paper trail he left, thick enough to reconstruct the broad contours of his life, thin enough to leave many personal details unknown, mirrors the way his story sits within the larger history of American organized crime, visible at the outline, blurred at the edges, emblematic of a world that shaped and was shaped by men very much like him. Through the early 1960s, as the internal war that followed the kidnapping of Joseph Prophesy played itself out, the world that had once revolved around Frank Abbatemarco's quiet efficiency continued to change. Men who had known him well were now at the center of a struggle that mixed personal resentments, generational ambition, and long-standing grievances about money. The numbers racket he had spent so many years managing in South Brooklyn remained one of the crucial prizes, still generating a steady stream of small bets from people who, in most cases, barely remembered the man who had once been at the top of that local pyramid. The first major shift after his death came not from the streets but from nature. In June 1962, Joseph Prophesy, the cautious, tight-fisted boss who had presided over the family since the 1930s, died of cancer. His passing temporarily eased some of the immediate tension. The man whose unyielding approach to tribute had helped set the stage for both Abbatemarco's murder and the Gallow rebellion was gone. In his place, at least formally, stood Joseph Magliacco, long a close lieutenant and underboss. On paper, This appeared to be a smooth transition. The same core leadership remained, with a familiar figure stepping into the top role. But the reality was less stable. Prophesied death did not erase the memory of his policies, nor did it suddenly reconcile the factions that had formed in opposition to him. The Gallow group, which had already shown itself willing to kidnap and fight rather than submit quietly, viewed Magliocco with suspicion. They saw him as an extension of the old regime, not as a true break from it. The areas of South Brooklyn that had once paid directly to Abbatemarco and then to them remained under their effective control, but the question of how much they would pass upward, and to whom, was still unsettled. At the same time, forces outside the family were paying closer attention. The fallout from Apalachin continued to reshape law enforcement priorities. FBI agents in New York, previously hesitant to focus on mafia cases for fear of stepping into what they had often regarded as local police matters, now had explicit instructions from Washington to track top hoodlums and their operations. Files on the Prophesy/Magliocco organization grew thicker, updated with reports on factional squabbles, suspected murders, and the status of key money-making rackets. The name Abbatemarco appeared less frequently as a living subject and more as a point of reference, a way to situate newer developments. Former Abbatemarco gambling area now under Gallow control, one notation might read. The unraveling at the top accelerated later in 1963, when a plot emerged that had nothing directly to do with South Brooklyn numbers but everything to do with the stability of the family. Joseph Magliocco had entered into a secret arrangement with Joseph Bonanno, boss of another New York family, to eliminate several rival leaders and seize broader power. When the plot was exposed, the Commission, the informal national board of mafia bosses, moved swiftly. Bonanno was sidelined. Magliocco was forced to step down. In his place, the Commission approved a younger, relatively untested figure as the new head of the erstwhile Prophesy organization, Joseph Colombo. Colombo's rise marked another turning point. He had not been deeply identified with the old Calabrian core of the family and was seen as more flexible, at least initially. One of his first priorities was to tamp down the lingering rebellion in South Brooklyn, making peace with the Gallows, whose control over lucrative numbers and loan sharking operations gave them real leverage, was essential to stabilizing the family he had just inherited. Agreements were reached that granted the rebels some measure of recognition and autonomy within the reconstituted structure. Territories were divided. Financial arrangements were renegotiated. For a time, the shooting slowed. The Abbatemarco legacy was woven into these new arrangements. The policy network Frank had built was now openly acknowledged as a central asset within what was soon generally called the Colombo family. The crew that controlled it, centered on the Gallows and their closest associates, was no longer treated as a rogue element to be wiped out, but as a faction that had to be accommodated. Men bearing the Abbatemarco name moved within this reconfigured landscape, not as outsiders, but as descendants of a man whose former importance gave them a certain weight. Law enforcement never lost sight of the family connection. In the mid-1960s, as federal and local agencies increased their use of wiretaps under new legal authorities, conversations among Colombo family associates were recorded in cars, social clubs, and pay phone booths. In the transcripts that later surfaced in court exhibits and investigative reports, surnames appeared with familiar regularity. The Gallows and their loyalists were overheard discussing collections, disputes, and the possibility of renewed trouble with the hierarchy. References to Frank's old thing, or the bank from Frankie's day, popped up occasionally, a reminder that even absent men still loomed in the shared memory of those who had worked under them. Meanwhile, broader developments in the city were changing the economic and social environment that had nurtured the numbers racket in the first place. The old piers of Red Hook and nearby waterfronts were losing ground to container shipping, and more modern port facilities elsewhere. Jobs that had once supported thousands of longshoremen and dock laborers dwindled. Urban renewal projects razed blocks of tenements and replaced them with public housing or industrial sites, displacing long-time residents. Highways cut through neighborhoods, including the Brooklyn, Queens Expressway, altering patterns of local commerce and isolating pockets of the community. Yet the appetite for small daily bets persisted. Even as the physical landscape changed, people who had grown up playing the numbers continued to seek out writers. The game had become part of the cultural fabric of working-class life, especially among older Italian-American, African-American, and Puerto Rican residents of the boroughs. Policy slips still moved from storefront to back room, from apartment hallway to bar counter, each one tying the present to the methods established in the days when men like Abbatemarco first organized the trade. But the foundations beneath it were beginning to shift in ways that would, over time, erode its profitability. One of the most significant of these shifts came from the state itself. In the late 1960s, New York moved to legalize certain forms of gambling that had long been the exclusive domain of the underground. The New York State Lottery was established in 1967, with its first games launching soon after. Officials openly acknowledged that part of the goal was to capture revenue that had been flowing untaxed through illegal numbers banks for decades. Ads encouraged citizens to play for schools rather than handing their bets to street writers. The format of some lottery games, daily drawings using 3-digit combinations, echoed the structure of the very policy contests the state was trying to supplant. For the organized crime figures who had relied on numbers as a mainstay, this posed a serious challenge. Some bettors, especially those with a long-standing mistrust of government, stuck with their traditional writers. Others were drawn to the legitimacy and perceived safety of state-run gambling. The underground numbers game did not vanish overnight, but its margins shrank. Adaptable bosses and bankers sought to differentiate their product, offering better odds, more flexible credit, or additional side bets. But the days when a man like Frank could preside over a relatively unchallenged monopoly on 3-digit wagers in a neighborhood were gone. At the same time, the legal tools available to prosecutors sharpened dramatically. In 1968, Congress passed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, which among other things clarified procedures for electronic surveillance. 2 years later, the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970 introduced the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Statute, better known as RICO. For the first time, federal prosecutors had a powerful mechanism for portraying repeated gambling, extortion, and loan sharking offenses not as isolated crimes, but as part of a pattern of racketeering activity carried out by an ongoing criminal enterprise. In the training seminars that followed these legislative changes, senior agents and prosecutors often drew on past cases to illustrate how RICO could have applied, had it existed earlier. The career of someone like Abbatemarco, marked by repeated gambling arrests, long-term association with a recognized crime family, and supervisory control over a multi-layered illegal business, was a textbook example. Where earlier law enforcement efforts had been forced to nibble at the edges of such operations through low-level gambling charges, RICO now allowed the entire structure to be presented as a conspiracy. In this way, even in death, his file served as a kind of teaching tool, a model of the type of mid-level figure the new law was designed to target. For the Colombo family, the 1970s brought another round of upheaval. The uneasy peace Joe Colombo had brokered with the Gallow faction began to fray. Colombo himself, in a move that perplexed many older mobsters, thrust his name and face into the public arena by founding the Italian-American Civil Rights League. He organized rallies and demonstrations, protesting what he claimed was unfair stereotyping of Italian Americans as criminals, particularly in FBI materials. At first, his campaigns attracted some sympathy in the broader community, but within the underworld they were viewed as dangerously provocative. By putting himself in front of cameras and microphones, Colombo was also putting the structure and existence of the mafia under new scrutiny. In June 1971, during a League rally at Columbus Circle in Manhattan, Colombo was shot and critically wounded by a gunman who was immediately killed by bodyguards. Colombo survived but was left incapacitated, lingering in a coma for years. The shooting's precise origins remain contested among historians and law enforcement, but its immediate effect was undeniable. The family that bore his name was leaderless in any practical sense, and old grievances resurfaced. Joey Gallow, who had spent part of the 1960s in prison on extortion charges and emerged with a sharpened sense of his own place in the world, was once again a focal point of tension. In 1972, he was himself murdered in a now famous attack at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. These headline-grabbing events did not directly involve the surviving Abbatemarcos, but they unfolded in a world they knew intimately. The wars of succession inside the Colombo family reverberated back through the same social clubs and streets where Frank had once quietly collected his cut of the numbers money. For his sons and other relatives involved in low-level gambling or associated rackets, each transition at the top meant recalculating allegiances, renegotiating protection, and reassessing the risk of being caught in the crossfire of another family dispute. Law enforcement files from the 1970s and early 1980s contain occasional references to these younger Abbatemarcos. They appear in surveillance reports as participants in meetings with known Colombo associates, in arrest logs tied to policy operation that had stubbornly survived despite the rise of the state lottery, and in informant statements describing who controlled which corners of the remaining illegal gambling trade. In no case did any of them rise to the prominence their father had once held. The structure of the underworld had changed too much, and the legal environment had become far more hostile to the kind of semi-visible, long tenure role Frank had occupied. By this time, too, the neighborhoods that had once formed the core of his territory were no longer quite the same. Waves of demographic change, driven by both economic shifts and city planning decisions, altered the composition of South Brooklyn. Many Italian-American families moved to other parts of the borough or to the suburbs, replaced by new immigrant communities and internal migrants from other parts of the United States. Red Hook, in particular, suffered from disinvestment, high unemployment, and a reputation for crime unrelated to the old mafia structures, issues tied more to drug markets and street gangs than to organized, hierarchical racketeering. The numbers racket adapted to these changes in its own way. In predominantly African American and Latino neighborhoods, new policy kings emerged, sometimes with loose ties to Italian families, sometimes operating independently. The methods remained recognizably similar: street writers, coded slips, secret banks, but the ethnic and cultural context shifted. For older Italian American mobsters, this reduced the centrality of numbers to their own business portfolios. They turned more toward other rackets: construction fraud, union corruption, higher-level loan sharking, and for some, drug trafficking, despite long-standing official prohibitions on narcotics within mafia circles. In this evolving world, the memory of men like Abbatemarco became more a matter of internal folklore than of current operational relevance. Among the dwindling group of older Colombo members who had come of age in the 1940s and 1950s, his name still had resonance. They told stories, sometimes to younger associates, sometimes to law enforcement after flipping, about the old bookmakers and policy bankers who had run things differently, more quietly, before the era of televised hearings and federal wiretaps. In those stories, Frank figured as a representative of a particular style: low-key, methodical, focused on gambling rather than high-risk ventures. Outside that small circle, his presence faded. Popular culture, when it turned to mafia figures in the 1970s and 1980s, gravitated toward bosses and dramatic conflicts, not mid-level gambling men. Films and novels drew on composite archetypes rather than specific, lesser-known individuals. A viewer familiar with the history might recognize fragments of his world: a policy operation tucked into a Brooklyn bar, a middle-aged lieutenant quietly counting cash in a back room, but his name seldom appeared directly. The narrative space he had occupied in real life was absorbed into a broader, stylized image of organized crime. Academics and journalists who studied the mafia with a more granular lens, however, continued to find his case instructive. In works on illegal gambling, his operations were sometimes cited as examples of how deeply embedded numbers games had been in pre-lottery New York. In analyses of internal mafia discipline, his killing was highlighted as one of several pivotal incidents that destabilized the Prophesy/Colombo family and helped trigger the Gallow Wars. In portraits of waterfront Brooklyn, his activities appeared alongside union racketeering, loan sharking, and other practices that together constituted an alternative power structure in immigrant neighborhoods. The long arc from his youth in crowded tenements to these later scholarly treatments underscores how tightly an individual life can be interwoven with the structural evolution of a city and its institutions. The forces that shaped his choices: the poverty of early 20th century Italian immigrants, the sudden opportunities of Prohibition, the hardening of loose gangs into formal crime families, the grudging accommodation between law enforcement and entrenched rackets, were not unique to him. But his particular path through them, culminating in a very specific set of conflicts over money and loyalty, left a set of traces detailed enough for later generations to follow. By the closing decades of the 20th century, as federal prosecutions chipped away at the leadership of New York's major mafia families, and the old waterfront communities underwent further cycles of decline and gentrification, the world that had made Frankie Shots possible was largely gone. State lotteries, casinos, and other legal forms of gambling had absorbed much of the demand that had once fueled his policy banks. The legal system, armed with RICO and a more coordinated investigative apparatus, was better equipped to dismantle the kind of mid-level fiefdoms he had run. The Italian-American neighborhoods that had once treated men like him as both threat and patron were now more likely to harbor a mix of long-time residents and newcomers with little direct connection to that history. And yet, in old case files and in the memories of those who study or recall that era, his figure still appears. A man whose business depended on thousands of small acts recorded in pencil on thin slips of paper, whose authority rested on an unspoken combination of trust and fear, and whose downfall exposed the vulnerabilities that lay beneath the surface calm of mid-century organized crime. His story, seen against the backdrop of the decades that followed his death, offers a vantage point from which to understand not only how one gambler's son rose and fell, but how the broader system that sustained him was transformed and, in important ways, dismantled. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the world that had once depended so heavily on men like Frank Abbatemarco was being dismantled in courtrooms instead of alleys. Federal prosecutors, armed with RICO indictments and years of accumulated surveillance, turned their attention squarely on New York's 5 major mafia families. The Colombo organization, born out of the old Prophesy regime that had ruled over Frank's numbers rackets, became a particular focus. Wiretaps, informants, and flipped capos gave prosecutors a clearer view than ever before of the inner workings of a structure that had long thrived on secrecy. In those indictments and trial transcripts, the Abbatemarco name reappeared, not as the central story but as part of a recurring backdrop. One of Frank's sons, Anthony, surfaced in law enforcement records as a Colombo associate who followed his father into gambling and related rackets. In the 1980s, he was identified in federal cases as part of the family's Brooklyn contingent, a man whose underworld education had begun at home. His career, like his father's, revolved around collecting bets, extending credit, and enforcing payments. Unlike his father, he operated in an era when RICO allowed prosecutors to frame such activity as part of a broader pattern of racketeering, with much harsher penalties. The pressures that came with this new legal environment were intense. Where mid-century mobsters could treat individual gambling arrests as the cost of doing business, RICO made it possible to turn a series of relatively minor offenses into a single, sweeping case carrying decades in prison. For men like Anthony, raised in the mythology of the old neighborhood and the apparent stability of his father's career, the reality of the 1980s was very different. The FBI no longer contented itself with noting who controlled which corner. Agents now spent years building cases designed to show exactly how those corners fed into a coherent, ongoing criminal enterprise. Some of those men chose to resist and went to trial, gambling that juries might be swayed by doubts about complex conspiracy charges. Others, facing the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in prison, made choices that would have been unthinkable in Frank's time. They agreed to cooperate. In exchange for reduced sentences and protection, they sat in witness boxes and explained under oath how the numbers game worked in practice, how tribute moved up the chain, and how disputes were settled. In doing so, they provided a level of detail about the inner mechanics of rackets like the one Abbatemarco had once run that outsiders had never before been able to document so precisely. Their testimony, combined with declassified FBI files released under the Freedom of Information Act, allowed historians and journalists to reconstruct much of the economic and social world that had sustained men like Frank. Where earlier accounts had relied heavily on police press releases and occasional newspaper interviews with anonymous underworld sources, researchers now had access to surveillance logs, intercepted conversations, and internal memoranda. In these documents, Abbatemarco's name appeared as a reference point. Abbatemarco Policy Bank, former Abbatemarco Territory, sons of deceased bookmaker, phrases that linked newer cases to a longer history. One effect of this archival opening was to demystify aspects of the numbers racket that had once been wrapped in a kind of cloak and dagger aura. The basic mechanics, the three-digit bets, the reliance on published figures to determine winning numbers, the hierarchical structure of writers, runners, and bankers, could be mapped in charts and flow diagrams. Yet the documents also highlighted the intensely local character of operations like Frank's. Each neighborhood imposed its own nuances. Particular store owners who acted as informal hubs, specific church festivals that saw spikes in betting, localized slang that flavored everyday business. The Red Hook pattern, with its mix of longshoremen, shopkeepers, and housewives, looked different in important ways from the Harlem or East Harlem numbers scenes that were the subject of other academic studies. Historians of gambling culture, in books and articles published from the 1990s onward, placed Abbatemarco into a wider mosaic. Studies of the policy game in African American neighborhoods, for example, emphasized both the entrepreneurial skills of black numbers bankers and the ways in which Italian American crime families extracted tribute from them. In that literature, Frankie Shots was one of many Italian figures who operated parallel to, and sometimes above, black-run policy operations. His role in South Brooklyn, where Italian immigrants dominated the trade locally, offered a counterpoint. A case where the entire chain of the numbers racket, from street writer to family boss, was contained within a single ethnic community. Other scholars, focusing not on gambling itself but on the sociology of organized crime, used his life to illustrate the concept of the middleman in criminal hierarchies. Bosses like Prophesy or Colombo were too distant for most neighborhood residents to see or interact with directly. At the other end of the spectrum, street writers and low-level collectors were too numerous and replaceable to embody the system as a whole. Men like Abbatemarco occupied the middle, close enough to the top to be recognized within the family, close enough to the base to be remembered by name decades later on the streets where they had once worked. When such men died violently, as Frank did in 1959, the shock waves moved both upward and downward, disrupting financial flows and neighborhood routines alike. If academic and legal sources painted one picture, oral histories and journalistic fieldwork painted another, sometimes overlapping, sometimes at odds. In the 1980s and 1990s, as interest in the old Brooklyn grew among writers and documentary filmmakers, reporters walked the streets of Red Hook and Carroll Gardens in search of people who still remembered the mid-century years. On stoops and in corner bars, older residents, Italians who had stayed or who returned to visit from the suburbs, told stories of a vanished world, of dock work and feast days, of crowded tenements and tight church communities, and of the quiet men who had run the policy before the lottery came. In those reminiscences, Frank was often described in simple human terms. He was a nice dresser, someone remembered, or the guy who'd have a roll of bills but never showed off. Another might recall how he'd sit in the back, have a coffee, talk soft, or how, on occasion, he would help a struggling family cover funeral costs or rent, gestures that weighed heavily in community memory. When asked about his violent death, some shrugged and spoke of it as the life catching up with him. Others hinted at anger that such a quiet guy had been sacrificed to settle accounts that, in their view, should have been managed differently. Almost all, however, treated the subject with a certain caution. Even decades later, a residual instinct formed in a time when talking too openly about such matters could invite real danger. These recollections reveal how the social meaning of a figure like Abbatemarco can differ sharply depending on one's vantage point. To the law, he was a persistent violator of gambling statutes, a component of a structure that used threats to secure payment and enriched itself at the expense of poor bettors. To academic analysts, he was an illustrative case, a man whose choices were shaped by macro forces like immigration, urban poverty, and the evolution of criminal institutions. To many of his neighbors, however, he was simply part of the fabric of their daily lives, someone they recognized on sight, whose presence in a bar or at a street corner lent an air of continuity to a neighborhood constantly under economic and political strain. The Italian-American community itself wrestled with how to place such men within its collective memory. From the 1970s onward, groups like the Italian-American Civil Rights League, in its early, Colombo-linked incarnation, and later more broad-based organizations pushed back against the media's fixation on the mafia as a defining feature of Italian identity. Community leaders pointed out that the vast majority of Italian Americans had built their lives through hard work in factories, offices, and small businesses, with no connection to organized crime. They criticized films and television series that, in their view, glamorized mobsters and overshadowed stories of ordinary families. Yet it was impossible to deny that figures like Abbatemarco had been real, and in certain neighborhoods and decades, influential. Some community historians chose to confront this head-on, including chapters on local racketeers in broader accounts of neighborhood history, but framing them as products of specific historical conditions rather than as embodiments of some national trait. In such narratives, Frank appears as one among many responses to the constraints early Italian immigrants faced, neither excused nor demonized, but situated within a spectrum of survival strategies that ranged from union organizing to petty crime, mutual aid societies to racketeering. That attempt at nuanced portrayal sometimes clashed with the more sensationalistic approach taken by parts of the entertainment industry. Movies and novels set in mid-century Brooklyn leaned heavily on the imagery of neighborhood bookmakers, envelopes of cash, and backroom deals. While these works often drew on real details, policy slips, tributes, the quiet killing of an inconvenient earner, they recombined them into composite characters designed to fit dramatic arcs. Audiences came to know fictionalized versions of Frankie Shots, more than the man himself. Archetypes of the world-weary lieutenant or the loyal soldier undone by internal politics. In this sense, his posthumous reputation became part of a broader debate about how to remember the Mafia era. Was it a dark undercurrent in American urban history, best understood through court records and sociological studies? Or was it, as some storytellers presented it, a kind of tragic subculture, full of its own codes and pathos? The actual record of Abbatemarco's life resists both stark condemnation and romanticism. He participated, willingly and over many years, in activities that harmed his neighbors, however quietly, draining money from people who could ill afford it, reinforcing a climate of fear in which disputes were not taken to public institutions. At the same time, he was not a flamboyant predator, but a man whose formative years had offered him few clear pathways to prosperity or status outside the underworld. By the turn of the 21st century, Red Hook itself had once again become an object of wider interest, this time to urban planners, developers, and newcomers drawn by its waterfront views and industrial aesthetic. Warehouses that once stored cargo unloaded by dockworkers who played Frank's numbers were converted into artist studios, galleries, and, eventually, high-end apartments. Trendy restaurants opened on streets where policy slips had changed hands in the 1940s and 1950s. Longtime residents, some descended from the early Italian settlers, watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Relief at new investment after decades of neglect, unease at rising rents, and the displacement of families who had weathered the neighborhood's hardest times. In this new Red Hook, the traces of Abbatemarco's world are subtle. A former social club's facade, now repainted and repurposed, still hints at its past in the arrangement of its narrow windows. An elderly parishioner remembers that, when he was a boy serving as an altar boy at a local church, certain men in dark coats always occupied the same pew. Men whose respect the priest both appreciated and feared. A street corner where, in mid-century photographs, knots of men in flat caps stood talking now sees joggers and dog walkers pass by. The economic engine that once helped sustain the policy racket, steady wages on the docks, concentrated in a few blocks, has long since disappeared. Researchers who visit these streets today, armed with digitized newspaper archives and FOIA-released FBI files, must work to connect the physical landscape before them with the social geography of the 1930s through 1950s. In lectures and documentaries about organized crime, scholars sometimes project side-by-side images, a black and white photo of a crowded President Street bar, and a current color photograph of the same address, its signage and clientele utterly changed. Between the two, they trace lines of continuity and rupture, explaining how a man like Frankie Shots could have been both central to his time and nearly invisible in the modern landscape. In these contemporary retellings, his story serves several functions. It humanizes the abstract concept of the mafia by focusing not on legendary bosses, but on someone whose life was intimately tied to a single set of blocks and a specific illegal enterprise. It illustrates how organized crime can root itself in everyday practices, placing a small bet, borrowing a little to get through the week, rather than only in spectacular heists or violent showdowns. And it provides a case through which to explore the complex interactions between law enforcement, marginalized communities, and internal systems of order and discipline. Perhaps most importantly, his life and death highlight the costs of the underworld's apparent stability. For years, Frank's numbers operation gave the impression of a well-oiled machine that would always be there. The writers on their corners, the runners with their bundles of slips, the banker who made sure the bank could cover a lucky hit. Yet that stability depended on a structure in which any perceived shortfall in tribute or loyalty could be met with the most irreversible of sanctions. The same quiet efficiency that allowed him to operate for decades without major prison time meant that, when his accounting no longer satisfied his superiors, he had little recourse. The system he had served offered no meaningful safety net, only an abrupt end. As the 21st century progresses, new generations encounter his name less often. They learn about organized crime, if at all, through high-profile cases against remaining mafia figures, or through dramatized retellings of a world that no longer exists in its old form. Yet for those who seek to understand how that world came to be, and how it intersected with the broader history of immigration, urban development, and law enforcement in the United States, the outline of Frank Abbatemarco's life remains instructive. It captures, in a single trajectory, the rise of a particular form of organized crime, its entanglement with local communities, and the pressures that eventually helped to unravel it. In the end, his legacy is not measured in the sums he once handled or the fear his name briefly inspired, but in what his story reveals about the era that produced him. The boy who grew up amid tenement overcrowding and dockside hustles became, through a series of choices and opportunities, a central figure in a neighborhood economy that operated outside the law. His quiet rise and violent fall chart both the reach and the limits of that economy. And in the surviving fragments of his life, police notations, neighbors' memories, historians, reconstructions, we can still trace the contours of a city struggling, over many decades, with the question of who would control the flows of money and power running just beneath its everyday surface. To follow the threads of Frank Abbatemarco's life into the present is to move ever further from the man himself, and ever deeper into the traces that others left behind. Unlike some of the more flamboyant gangsters of his era, he did not give interviews, leave memoirs, or cultivate a public persona beyond his neighborhood. There are no surviving letters in which he lays out his view of the world, no tape-recorded conversations in which he explains his choices in his own words. What we know comes almost entirely from institutions that regarded him as a problem to be solved. Police departments, federal agencies, prosecutors' offices, and, indirectly, the journalists and historians who later mined those archives. Those sources are indispensable, but they are not neutral. A police report that lists him as a known policy banker is by design a snapshot of his most incriminating role, stripped of everything else. An FBI memo that notes he was seen leaving a particular club at 11:15 p.m. in the company of named associates tells us something about his habits of association, but nothing about his thoughts as he walked through the door. Testimony from informants or cooperating witnesses, even when corroborated and useful, is filtered through their own agendas. The desire to reduce a sentence, to settle old scores, or simply to make sense of a world they are now describing from the outside. Even so, patterns emerge. Taken together, these documents show a man who spent at least 2 decades as a stable, mid-level actor in the Prophesy family's gambling economy. They show how his operations were structured, who worked under him, what kinds of revenue he generated, and ultimately, how his position became untenable when the financial demands placed upon him collided with changing conditions on the street. They record the fact of his violent death, the official uncertainty about its perpetrators, and the unofficial certainty within his milieu that it had been ordered from above and carried out by men who had once worked for him. What they do not show is the full texture of his daily life. We can infer, from circumstantial evidence and broader social context, that he was enmeshed in the routines of a tight-knit community, that he attended family gatherings, that he was known to local shopkeepers, that his children experienced him as a father before they knew him as anything else. We know that he moved through a world shaped by the Italian language and Catholic ritual, by the expectations and pressures of a patriarchal household, by the pride and defensiveness of a group that had been treated as outsiders for much of the first half of the 20th century. But those aspects of his story are necessarily more general, drawn from what we know of similar families in similar places, rather than from direct evidence about his own. This gap between the documented and the experienced is one of the central challenges in telling his story. It is easy, when working from police files, to allow the categories used by law enforcement to define a life completely. Bookmaker, racketeer, policy banker, capo. Those labels capture real, consequential aspects of what he did, but they risk flattening him into a type. On the other hand, to speculate too freely about his inner life, to imagine remorse, satisfaction, guilt, or pride where the record is silent, would be to drift into fiction, imposing our own narratives on a man we can glimpse only through the keyholes left open by official scrutiny and long-ago recollection. What can be said with confidence is that his career illustrates in concentrated form the workings of the illegal numbers game in mid-century New York. The basic math of that game was unforgiving. Bettors chose 3 digits. If they hit, they stood to gain a substantial multiple of their stake, often several hundred to 1. The odds of picking the correct 3-digit number were, however, 1,000 to 1. By paying out at less than true odds, policy bankers ensured that over time, the game would yield a steady profit, so long as they could keep the volume of bets high and their own exposure to large hits manageable. For players, the numbers were a mixture of entertainment, ritual, and desperate hope. Some picked combinations based on birthdays, anniversaries, or addresses. Others consulted dream books that claimed to translate common dreams into lucky numbers. A small hit could feel like a validation of one's intuition. A near miss might be taken as a sign that persistence would be rewarded next time. In this way, the policy game tapped into the same psychological currents that later state lotteries would exploit. The allure of sudden, transformative luck in lives otherwise hemmed in by low wages and limited prospects. But beneath the small pleasures of choosing and playing lay a more sobering reality. For every winner, there were hundreds of losers whose nickels and dimes added up. Over weeks and years, the money lost to the numbers was money not spent on rent, food, clothing, or savings. In the most vulnerable households, persistent play could deepen existing financial precarity. When debts accumulated, whether from gambling losses or from other needs, figures in Abbatemarco's world were ready with offers of high-interest loans, backed not by legal contracts, but by the implicit threat of consequences if repayment was not forthcoming. The same network that provided a familiar face at the corner bar could, when necessary, send a much more intimidating face to the door. In this sense, the harm associated with Frank's trade was rarely spectacular. It did not often take the visible form of broken bones or sensational robberies, though such violence existed in the background for those who fell too far behind. Instead, it was incremental, a constant, quiet siphoning of resources from people who had little to spare, enforced by a climate of unspoken coercion. For many of his neighbors, especially in the earlier years of his operation, the formal banking system was either inaccessible or untrustworthy. The state's own safety nets were thin. Men like him, itself, but on the sociology of organized crime, used his life to illustrate the concept of the middleman in criminal hierarchies. Bosses like Prophesy or Columbo were too distant for most neighborhood residents to see or interact with directly. At the other end of the spectrum, street writers and low-level collectors were too numerous and replaceable to embody the system as a whole. Men like Abbatemarco occupied the middle, close enough to the top to be recognized within the family, close enough to the base to be remembered by name decades later on the streets where they had once worked. When such men died violently, as Frank did in 1959, the shock waves moved both upward and downward, disrupting financial flows and neighborhood routines alike. If academic and legal sources painted one picture, oral histories and journalistic fieldwork painted another, sometimes overlapping, sometimes at odds. In the 1980s and 1990s, as interest in the old Brooklyn grew among writers and documentary filmmakers, reporters walked the streets of Red Hook and Carroll Gardens in search of people who still remembered the mid-century years. On stoops and in corner bars, older residents, Italians who had stayed, or who returned to visit from the suburbs, told stories of a vanished world, of dock work and feast days, of crowded tenements and tight church communities, and of the quiet men who had run the policy before the lottery came. In those reminiscences, Frank was often described in simple human terms. He was a nice dresser, someone remembered, or the guy who'd have a roll of bills but never showed off. Another might recall how he'd sit in the back, have a coffee, talk soft, or how, on occasion, he would help a struggling family cover funeral costs or rent, gestures that weighed heavily in community memory. When asked about his violent death, some shrugged and spoke of it as the life catching up with him. Others hinted at anger that such a quiet guy had been sacrificed to settle accounts that, in their view, should have been managed differently. Almost all, however, treated the subject with a certain caution. Even decades later, a residual instinct formed in a time when talking too openly about such matters could invite real danger. These recollections reveal how the social meaning of a figure like Abbatemarco can differ sharply depending on one's vantage point. To the law, he was a persistent violator of gambling statutes, a component of a structure that used threats to secure payment and enriched itself at the expense of poor bettors. To academic analysts, he was an illustrative case, a man whose choices were shaped by macro forces like immigration, urban poverty, and the evolution of criminal institutions. To many of his neighbors, however, he was simply part of the fabric of their daily lives, someone they recognized on sight, whose presence in a bar or at a street corner lent an air of continuity to a neighborhood constantly under economic and political strain. The Italian-American community itself wrestled with how to place such men within its collective memory. From the 1970s onward, groups like the Italian-American Civil Rights League, in its early, Colombo-linked incarnation, and later more broad-based organizations pushed back against the media's fixation on the mafia as a defining feature of Italian identity. Community leaders pointed out that the vast majority of Italian Americans had built their lives through hard work in factories, offices, and small businesses, with no connection to organized crime. They criticized films and television series that, in their view, glamorized mobsters and overshadowed stories of ordinary families. Yet it was impossible to deny that figures like Abbatemarco had been real, and in certain neighborhoods and decades, influential. Some community historians chose to confront this head-on, including chapters on local racketeers in broader accounts of neighborhood history, but framing them as products of specific historical conditions rather than as embodiments of some national trait. In such narratives, Frank appears as one among many responses to the constraints early Italian immigrants faced, neither excused nor demonized, but situated within a spectrum of survival strategies that ranged from union organizing to petty crime, mutual aid societies to racketeering. That attempt at nuanced portrayal sometimes clashed with the more sensationalistic approach taken by parts of the entertainment industry. Movies and novels set in mid-century Brooklyn leaned heavily on the imagery of neighborhood bookmakers, envelopes of cash, and backroom deals. While these works often drew on real details, policy slips, tributes, the quiet killing of an inconvenient earner, they recombined them into composite characters designed to fit dramatic arcs. Audiences came to know fictionalized versions of Frankie Shots more than the man himself, archetypes of the world-weary lieutenant or the loyal soldier undone by internal politics. In this sense, his posthumous reputation became part of a broader debate about how to remember the mafia era. Was it a dark undercurrent in American urban history, best understood through court records and sociological studies? Or was it, as some storytellers presented it, a kind of tragic subculture, full of its own codes and pathos? The actual record of Abbatemarco's life resists both stark condemnation and romanticism. He participated, willingly and over many years, in activities that harmed his neighbors, however quietly, draining money from people who could ill afford it, reinforcing a climate of fear in which disputes were not taken to public institutions. At the same time, he was not a flamboyant predator, but a man whose formative years had offered him few clear pathways to prosperity or status outside the underworld. By the turn of the 21st century, Red Hook itself had once again become an object of wider interest, this time to urban planners, developers, and newcomers drawn by its waterfront views and industrial aesthetic. Warehouses that once stored cargo unloaded by dockworkers who played Frank's numbers were converted into artist studios, galleries, and, eventually, high-end apartments. Trendy restaurants opened on streets where policy slips had changed hands in the 1940s and 1950s. Longtime residents, some descended from the early Italian settlers, watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Relief at new investment after decades of neglect, unease at rising rents, and the displacement of families who had weathered the neighborhood's hardest times. In this new Red Hook, the traces of Abbatemarco's world are subtle. A former social club's facade, now repainted and repurposed, still hints at its past in the arrangement of its narrow windows. An elderly parishioner remembers that, when he was a boy serving as an altar boy at a local church, certain men in dark coats always occupied the same pew. Men whose respect the priest both appreciated and feared. A street corner where, in mid-century photographs, knots of men in flat caps stood talking now sees joggers and dog walkers pass by. The economic engine that once helped sustain the policy racket, steady wages on the docks, concentrated in a few blocks, has long since disappeared. Researchers who visit these streets today, armed with digitized newspaper archives and FOIA-released FBI files, must work to connect the physical landscape before them with the social geography of the 1930s through 1950s. In lectures and documentaries about organized crime, scholars sometimes project side-by-side images. A black and white photo of a crowded President Street bar, and a current color photograph of the same address, its signage and clientele utterly changed. Between the two, they trace lines of continuity and rupture, explaining how a man like Frankie Shots could have been both central to his time and nearly invisible in the modern landscape. In these contemporary retellings, his story serves several functions. It humanizes the abstract concept of the mafia by focusing not on legendary bosses, but on someone whose life was intimately tied to a single set of blocks and a specific illegal enterprise. It illustrates how organized crime can root itself in everyday practices, placing a small bet, borrowing a little to get through the week, rather than only in spectacular heists or violent showdowns. And it provides a case through which to explore the complex interactions between law enforcement, marginalized communities, and internal systems of order and discipline. Perhaps most importantly, his life and death highlight the costs of the underworld's apparent stability. For years, Frank's numbers operation gave the impression of a well-oiled machine that would always be there. The writers on their corners, the runners with their bundles of slips, the banker who made sure the bank could cover a lucky hit. Yet that stability depended on a structure in which any perceived shortfall in tribute or loyalty could be met with the most irreversible of sanctions. The same quiet efficiency that allowed him to operate for decades without major prison time meant that, when his accounting no longer satisfied his superiors, he had little recourse. The system he had served offered no meaningful safety net, only an abrupt end. As the 21st century progresses, new generations encounter his name less often. They learn about organized crime, if at all, through high-profile cases against remaining mafia figures, or through dramatized retellings of a world that no longer exists in its old form. Yet for those who seek to understand how that world came to be, and how it intersected with the broader history of immigration, urban development, and law enforcement in the United States, the outline of Frank Abbatemarco's life remains instructive. It captures, in a single trajectory, the rise of a particular form of organized crime, its entanglement with local communities, and the pressures that eventually helped to unravel it. In the end, his legacy is not measured in the sums he once handled or the fear his name briefly inspired, but in what his story reveals about the era that produced him. The boy who grew up amid tenement overcrowding and dockside hustles became, through a series of choices and opportunities, a central figure in a neighborhood economy that operated outside the law. His quiet rise and violent fall chart both the reach and the limits of that economy. And in the surviving fragments of his life, police notations, neighbors' memories, historians, reconstructions, we can still trace the contours of a city struggling, over many decades, with the question of who would control the flows of money and power running just beneath its everyday surface. To follow the threads of Frank Abbatemarco's life into the present is to move ever further from the man himself and ever deeper into the traces that others left behind. Unlike some of the more flamboyant gangsters of his era, he did not give interviews, leave memoirs, or cultivate a public persona beyond his neighborhood. There are no surviving letters in which he lays out his view of the world, no tape-recorded conversations in which he explains his choices in his own words. What we know comes almost entirely from institutions that regarded him as a problem to be solved. Police departments, federal agencies, prosecutors' offices, and, indirectly, the journalists and historians who later mined those archives. Those sources are indispensable, but they are not neutral. A police report that lists him as a known policy banker is by design a snapshot of his most incriminating role, stripped of everything else. An FBI memo that notes he was seen leaving a particular club at 11:15 p.m. in the company of named associates tells us something about his habits of association, but nothing about his thoughts as he walked through the door. Testimony from informants or cooperating witnesses, even when corroborated and useful, is filtered through their own agendas. The desire to reduce a sentence, to settle old scores, or simply to make sense of a world they are now describing from the outside. Even so, patterns emerge. Taken together, these documents show a man who spent at least 2 decades as a stable, mid-level actor in the Prophesy family's gambling economy. They show how his operations were structured, who worked under him, what kinds of revenue he generated, and ultimately, how his position became untenable when the financial demands placed upon him collided with changing conditions on the street. They record the fact of his violent death, the official uncertainty about its perpetrators, and the unofficial certainty within his milieu that it had been ordered from above and carried out by men who had once worked for him. What they do not show is the full texture of his daily life. We can infer, from circumstantial evidence and broader social context, that he was enmeshed in the routines of a tight-knit community, that he attended family gatherings, that he was known to local shopkeepers, that his children experienced him as a father before they knew him as anything else. We know that he moved through a world shaped by the Italian language and Catholic ritual, by the expectations and pressures of a patriarchal household, by the pride and defensiveness of a group that had been treated as outsiders for much of the first half of the 20th century. But those aspects of his story are necessarily more general, drawn from what we know of similar families in similar places, rather than from direct evidence about his own. This gap between the documented and the experienced is one of the central challenges in telling his story. It is easy, when working from police files, to allow the categories used by law enforcement to define a life completely. Bookmaker, racketeer, policy banker, capo. Those labels capture real, consequential aspects of what he did, but they risk flattening him into a type. On the other hand, to speculate too freely about his inner life, to imagine remorse, satisfaction, guilt, or pride where the record is silent, would be to drift into fiction, imposing our own narratives on a man we can glimpse only through the keyholes left open by official scrutiny and long-ago recollection. What can be said with confidence is that his career illustrates, in concentrated form, the workings of the illegal numbers game in mid-century New York. The basic math of that game was unforgiving. Bettors chose 3 digits, If they hit, they stood to gain a substantial multiple of their stake, often several hundred to one. The odds of picking the correct three-digit number were, however, 1,000 to 1. By paying out at less than true odds, policy bankers ensured that over time, the game would yield a steady profit, so long as they could keep the volume of bets high and their own exposure to large hits manageable. For players, the numbers were a mixture of entertainment, ritual, and desperate hope. Some picked combinations based on birthdays, anniversaries, or addresses. Others consulted dream books that claimed to translate common dreams into lucky numbers. A small hit could feel like a validation of one's intuition. A near miss might be taken as a sign that persistence would be rewarded next time. In this way, the policy game tapped into the same psychological currents that later state lotteries would exploit. The allure of sudden, transformative luck in lives otherwise hemmed in by low wages and limited prospects. But beneath the small pleasures of choosing and playing lay a more sobering reality. For every winner, there were hundreds of losers whose nickels and dimes added up. Over weeks and years, the money lost to the numbers was money not spent on rent, food, clothing, or savings. In the most vulnerable households, persistent play could deepen existing financial precarity. When debts accumulated, whether from gambling losses or from other needs, figures in Abbatemarco's world were ready with offers of high-interest loans, backed not by legal contracts, but by the implicit threat of consequences if repayment was not forthcoming. The same network that provided a familiar face at the corner bar could, when necessary, send a much more intimidating face to the door. In this sense, the harm associated with Frank's trade was rarely spectacular. It did not often take the visible form of broken bones or sensational robberies, though such violence existed in the background for those who fell too far behind. Instead, it was incremental, a constant, quiet siphoning of resources from people who had little to spare, enforced by a climate of unspoken coercion. For many of his neighbors, especially in the earlier years of his operation, the formal banking system was either inaccessible or untrustworthy. The state's own safety nets were thin. Men like him,